Welcome everybody. This is our first big official talk of the fall season. We're opening strong. We have a really exciting lineup of author events and other talks and events here at the library this fall. And so welcome back everybody. We're so pleased to see you here. I am Janie Herman. I am the head of public programming here at the library. And welcome to our community room. We do have a hearing loop in this room if you need hearing assistance, and we do have hearing devices if you want to use those. They're over on top of the piano. Restrooms are out in the hall. And please silence your cell phones. So that's the housekeeping portion of this event out of the way. I'm going to give a quick introduction because I know we have a very full and very interesting presentation here tonight with two experts that we're all wanting to know much more about. So welcome to how Oswald Veblen quietly created Einstein's Princeton, which, Oswald Veblen is starting to get his due. He was a visionary mathematician, as we're going to find out, and he had a much bigger impact on Princeton than has been known. So I'm not going to give away the talk. I'm going to leave that up to our presenters. So first we're going to have Steve Hiltner. Steve is a writer, musician, naturalist, actor, as well as the president of the Friends of Herrontown Woods. He was trained in botany and water quality, and his interest in Oswald Veblen began with discovering the Veblen's house. It was all boarded up and neglected in Princeton's first ever nature preserve. Steve has devoted the years since that time to restoring not only the preserve and house, but also to making public the extraordinary and largely forgotten legacy of the Veblens. His historical research can be found at veblenhouse.org. And he is joined tonight by Cindy Srnka, who is a museum educator and nonprofit leader committed to cultural advocacy, historical preservation, environmental education, and public engagement in museums and heritage sectors. She is dedicated to heritage conservation, nonprofit development, and educational programming. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and she is currently on staff at the Historical Society of Princeton. So tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Historical Society of Princeton, and we're going to be back here with with Friends of Herrontown Woods with support from the Historical Society of Princeton. And we're going to be back here on Sunday with another event co-sponsored by the library and Herrontown Woods, which is a preview of a new musical. And I think Stephen's going to talk about that because Stephen is the one that brought this all to us. So everybody put your hands together and let's welcome Stephen to the library.
Whoa, it lifts up. Can I just keep going up? So cool. Excuse me while I have a moment with the machine. Thank you, Janie, and thanks to the library for hosting this event and also hosting the Einstein's Begonia musical on Sunday. I am Steve Hiltner, and thank you all for coming. Really happy to be here and to be able to talk about Oswald Veblen. I just wanted to briefly say something about Einstein's Begonia and about the Einstein Begonia, one of which is in the back there at a table. There's sign-up sheets if you want to find out more about Herrontown Woods. We're the Friends of Herrontown Woods, and we have events and stuff. Kim Dorman, who works here, she emailed me. I write about nature, and so I shouldn't be surprised that she emailed me asking if I knew where she could get an Einstein Begonia to give to her friend. And I had never heard of an Einstein Begonia. But I got on the internet, like I do with all the other kind of historical stuff, and I found a lot of information. And I actually found a friend Vicki Bertman, whose husband was a physicist, and I had known her through the Environmental Commission, and she had an Einstein Begonia, and she was willing to make some cuttings and give them to me so that I could pass a couple along to Kim's friend. So that was kind of fun. And then I wrote about it on my blog, the veblenhouse.org blog, and it started getting like thousands of page views, which I don't normally get. And comments, like people actually commented. And one of the comments was from Rebecca Pronsky, who said she had encountered a Einstein begonia, in her family, and she was writing a musical about it. So we communicated more, and then I did a little more research, just kind of working with her, and through Norma Smith, whose husband also is a physicist in town. She told me the backstory, the origin story. She was able to track this whole movement of Einstein begonias from home to home, office to office, and get back to the origin. So, which was, of course, Einstein himself. When he died, he left behind an Einstein begonia, and then Helen Dukas, his secretary, started making cuttings and giving them to her friends, and has kind of moved around Princeton and beyond Princeton. So that's kind of fun. That's happening on Sunday. So I'm going to launch into our talk about how Oswald Veblen quietly created Einstein's begonia. It's really hard to get that out of your mind. Einstein's Princeton. Okay, here we go. Cindy and I are here to talk about two extraordinary people, one of whom you will know very well, and the other you may have never heard of. Oswald Veblen was a mathematician and visionary who had a huge impact on mathematics in Princeton and beyond in the first half of the 20th century. But his influence went far beyond mathematics. He also had an impact on the development of computers and on the lives and careers of countless scholars. He and his wife, Elizabeth, can even be said to have founded the open space movement in Princeton. That you haven't heard of Oswald Veblen and his extraordinary legacy has to do with his uncanny ability to fly under the radar. Though he had a vital role in building the math department in Princeton from small beginnings in 1905 to a world center in 1931, he was never the department chair. And though it was his vision that triumphed in the evolution of the Institute for Advanced Study, he was never director. His aim was to advance mathematics and the careers of talented mathematicians, and he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to achieve that. He did not mind being overshadowed by the great mathematicians he brought to Princeton, people like Hermann Weyl, John von Neumann, and Kurt Gödel. Perhaps related to this, from an early age, he had become used to living in the shadow of his highly prominent Uncle Thorstein, the famed economist, social critic, and author of The Theory of the Leisure Class. No matter how much Oswald achieved in life, he would continue to be confused with his famous Uncle Thorstein. Oswald Veblen's greatest achievement, realizing his dream for a mathematical institute through the Institute for Advanced Study, also lay hidden later on because it was the Institute's founding director, Abraham Flexner, standing in the middle of that photo there, whose version of events prevailed. Flexner, who had a tendency to take credit for things, wrote an autobiography. Veblen did not. Though Flexner and Veblen worked closely to develop the Institute for Advanced Study, they ultimately came into conflict. Whether out of revenge or self-absorption, Flexner managed to write Veblen out of the story of the Institute's development and the story of how Einstein came to Princeton. For some reason, perhaps for the sake of a simplified storyline, Abraham Flexner's version of events was taken as gospel in Einstein biographies. The story of Oswald Veblen was lost. And so the story of Oswald Veblen slept in the archives of the Institute for Advanced Study and the Library of Congress. But in 2007, mathematician Steve Batterson wrote an article entitled "The Vision, Insight, and Influence of Oswald Veblen." His aim was to refamiliarize readers with Veblen, the renowned mathematician who, by the time he retired in 1950, had become known around the world as the statesman of mathematics. By not through mathematics, but by happening upon a house out in the woods, up along the ridge in northeastern Princeton. One thing I've done in Princeton is conduct plant inventories of most of the nature preserves. And back in 2007, I was in Herrontown Woods when I came upon a house in the forest, boarded up, abandoned. The preserve was neglected as well, with trails overgrown. I contacted the county, which owned the preserve at the time, and learned that the Veblens had donated Herrontown Woods, nearly 100 acres in their time, as Princeton's first nature preserve in 1957. Finding that house made me curious. Searching the internet, casting names into Google to see what came up. I used to be a fisherman, and I tell you, Google brings in some lunkers. I became something of a history buff. My research into the Veblens became my window into an era I otherwise would have known little about. In 2013, a few of us formed the Friends of Herrontown Woods, began reopening the trails, and fought successfully to keep the house from being demolished. The Veblens had donated the house to become a museum, a gathering place, and a library, and that is the dream of our nonprofit as well. Several years ago, on the other side of town, Cindy had her own discovery of Oswald Veblen due to her interest in the Institute Woods. Now, if you go to the Institute Woods, you may come across these 4 plaques that list the wonderful donors and open space groups that helped purchase a conservation easement to protect nearly 600 acres of the woods in the 1990s. Left unmentioned is the person who talked the Institute into acquiring that land half a century earlier. As Cindy learned as she researched the woods at the Institute archives, without Oswald Veblen's efforts and advocacy in the 1930s and 1940s, there would have been no Institute Woods to preserve. 2012 was another big year in rediscovering an additional facet of Veblen's legacy. Princeton University hosted an Alan Turing centennial to celebrate the birth of the brilliant mathematician Alan Turing, who is considered the father of theoretical computer science. I missed the conference, but was astonished to later learn that Oswald Veblen had been celebrated at the conference for his computer-related ballistics work for the military in World War I. George Dyson, who grew up at the Institute, included a chapter on Veblen in his book Turing's Cathedral. And David Alan Grier had also written about Veblen's military service. I encountered another lost story of Veblen at an extraordinary building on the Princeton University campus, now called Jones Hall. If you go there, you will see beautiful oak paneling, a common room where great mathematicians and physicists once gathered, and a famous quote by Einstein above the fireplace. You may find tourists looking for Einstein's first office. It would be understandable to think that the building was designed by an architect, and yet read the oral histories of the math department, and you learn that it was Oswald Veblen who designed what was originally called Old Fine Hall. Named after Henry Fine, who was the first and only chair of the Princeton math department from the turn of the century until he died tragically in 1928. The Joneses, wealthy friends of Henry Fine, provided the funding for this palace of mathematics. Veblen covered the details. He covered the whole size of it, which he had said originally it was going to be the size of an outhouse. He expanded that considerably. He had been in England at Oxford for a year, and he came back and he saw the designs and he said, well, we have to do better than that. So it turned into a hugely luxurious place. The Fine Hall that opened in 1931 was a dream Oswald Veblen had been dreaming and refining for many years prior. Veblen, who had traveled multiple times to Europe and studied closely the architecture and workings of its great universities, incorporated elements particularly from Oxford and Göttingen. Wanting to advance mathematics, Veblen designed a building that would meet the physical, emotional, and social needs of the scholars who would use it. Prior to the building of Fine Hall, most math professors lacked offices and had to work out of their homes. Fine Hall served as home not only to the math department, but also to the Institute for Advanced Study for its first 8 years. The building's size, comfort, and design reflecting Veblen's vision was a critical component in making Princeton uniquely attractive to Einstein and other great scholars. There was another facet of Veblen's career I had not been aware of. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, Veblen sprung into action to help find positions for displaced European scholars, not only in Princeton and at the newly formed institute, but across the country. Elise Graham has done some wonderful research on this, and Cindy will treat you to some of these stories as well. So, who was this Oswald Veblen who achieved all these extraordinary things, other than being the nephew of Thorstein Veblen? Born and raised in Iowa, Oswald was the oldest of 8 children, raised by a father who was the oldest of 10 children. Oswald's grandparents had immigrated from Norway and homesteaded in Wisconsin, my home state, and Minnesota, building a progression of farms. Oswald's father taught physics and math at the University of Iowa. Oswald came from a family of educators and deep thinkers. He graduated from the university at age 18, and despite his youth, won prizes in math and sharpshooting. He brought from the Midwest a love of the outdoors and a freedom from the conventions, formality, and prejudice that burdened some Eastern institutions. Women, African Americans, he would in his career be an advocate for great mathematical talents like Emmy Noether and William Claytor. Oswald Veblen arrived in academia at the dawn of the American century, when university education was in its infancy. The University of Chicago had opened its doors only 8 years prior. And when Veblen arrived in Princeton in 1905, Woodrow Wilson and Henry Fine were ushering in a new era for the university. A host of young mathematical talent came through Princeton during that time. Some stayed, while others went on to lead other math programs at other institutions. Through his marriage to Elizabeth May Richardson, we have May's Cafe, we have May's Garden, we have a lot of May out there in Herrontown Woods, who had grown up in Yorkshire, England. Oswald fell in love not only with Elizabeth, but also with England. Elizabeth's brother, Owen, a physicist and future winner of the Nobel Prize, would become an invaluable connection for Oswald to the highest levels of European science. What happened is that Owen Richardson was brought to Princeton in 1906, and he stayed for about, I think, 7-8 years, and his sister came along, and that's how Oswald and Elizabeth met. But that's also how Oswald got to meet Owen, and then when Owen went back to England, then he had this great contact. One novel way of measuring Oswald Veblen's legacy as a mathematician is through the mathematical genealogy project. It's where if you're the thesis advisor, you're like that person's father or mother, and then, so it just goes on and on and on. So his progeny are ever increasing as there's more and more theses written. And he's up to, what do we have? 17,520. A fun project. They just started one for the astronomers as well. My father was an astronomer, so he's now in the genealogy of that. Einstein's other options. Before handing things over to Cindy, I want to mention the California Institute of Technology, which throughout the 1920s had been trying to attract Einstein to California. Einstein had options beyond Caltech and Princeton, but these were the main two that I know of. In the early 1930s, as the Nazis rose to power, ultimately driving Jewish scholars out of German universities and putting a price on Einstein's head, it was not a given that Einstein would end up coming to Princeton. Physicist Robert Millikan had been courting Einstein for 10 years and hosted him at Caltech during 3 winters, beginning in 1931. Caltech was attractive to Einstein beyond the weather. Scientists there had done research that supported some of Einstein's theories, and the largest telescope in the world at that time, and eminent astronomers like Edwin Hubble were nearby on Mount Wilson. Einstein had become good friends with Charlie Chaplin. So Cindy found this talk from last year about, it's a historian at Caltech talking about Einstein. So it was really nice to get this other perspective. I was heartened to see the Caltech historian Diana Buchwald, in a presentation last year about Einstein in California, credited Oswald Veblen with attracting Einstein to New Jersey. Also, a factor by my reading was that Einstein's progressive politics, his pacifism, and outspoken concern about racial injustice repeatedly caused friction with the more conservative donors at Caltech. I don't know how big an issue that was, but it's interesting, all these different aspects that could have played in to making Einstein feel comfortable in Princeton. I tend to make lists, and you can't have a PowerPoint without like an inscrutable list of stuff on the screen. So here you go, it's your last chance, enjoy. What did I include in there? Carnegie Lake, he loved to sail. Have you ever read about Einstein's love for sailing? He couldn't swim. Come to think of it, my father sailed without learning to swim until he was like 60. So, but he wore a life jacket. Apparently, Einstein did not. He was fearless. There are a few landmarks in town that honor Veblen's legacy beyond, of course, Old Fine Hall, or Jones Hall, and the Institute, including a residential cul-de-sac named Veblen Circle, just up from Einstein Drive. The university recently named the South Terrace of Prospect House in honor of Veblen. Most meaningful for me and for our nonprofit is the living legacy of Herrontown Woods and the Veblen House that patiently awaits restoration. You can learn more about that at our websites and the literature on the table at the back of the room. Feel free to talk to me after the presentation. And now, over to Cindy.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for having me here tonight. So my part of the presentation, I love archives. Wherever I can get into an archive, I go. And I especially like to search through primary documents, and more importantly, correspondence from person to person. And it really is amazing to see what you can find and the conversations that you come upon. So my part of the presentation is going to present many of these little aspects that will kind of support what Steve talked about. So we are going to explore, and I'm looking over there, but I can look right here. We're going to explore Veblen, the Princeton's math department, and beyond. We're going to look at some personal stories and archival glimpses that reveal the character, relationships, and influence and legacy of Veblen, because for me, that's what's really important for me historically, the connection with Veblen. We're also going to dabble in Veblen and Einstein's evolving connection here and there, and their discrete yet powerful influence during a very, I'm going to say, tense time at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1939. And then lastly, if we have time, just spend a few glimpses of the Institute Woods. To begin, well, in May of 1921, Einstein was giving his lectures on his theory of relativity. And here we have a ticket to the opening event at Alexander Hall. And here at the Princeton University Weekly Bulletin, we have a full itinerary of the 5 lectures which he will give from Monday, May 9th through Friday, May 13th. Meanwhile, in November of 21, Veblen is hosting his math club at the university. And then I came across a letter from Veblen to Einstein that was dated September 16th, 1927. And this is the actual letter I came upon. It was a 9-page letter. You can see on the very first page it was written September 16th, as I said, 1927. He is vacationing in London. Steve mentioned Owen, and him and his wife are staying with Owen. And he writes, "Dear Professor Einstein, I sent you a telegram," but he's writing this up as kind of backup. And he's telling Einstein that after 2 years, Princeton has begun to seek money to be used in the support of research in pure science. And he goes on to say, part of the progress of that money that they've raised is they have research professorships that they are going to appoint people. And he goes on to list some of the appointments that were made, one of which is K.T. Compton. And if you look at the next page, it actually says that Veblen received a telegram from Compton asking whether he thinks that Einstein might be interested in one of these professorships. The salary offered is $10,000 a year because he states that's what everyone else is getting. I think the salary actually went up during the negotiation. But this is really kind of a first glimpse of Veblen trying to himself get Einstein, not to come to the Institute, of course, but to come to Princeton University. And then Steve talked about the fireplace, which you saw the beautiful picture of. And I found a letter that Veblen actually sent to Einstein. Steve mentioned that there was a quote that they put onto the fireplace mantle. And he writes, "It was your reply when someone asked if you thought that Miller's results would be verified." Now, I don't know very deeply the story about Miller. I do know that he challenged Einstein, and I believe it was Caltech that performed one, or tried to perform, proving his theory wrong in favor of Einstein. But in any case, Einstein then responds, and I have an English translation here, where he writes, "Dear Mr. Veblen, I remember my statement at that time and the occasion on which I made it. I have no objection to using it in the manner intended and consider this a special proof of friendly disposition. I would like to point out, however, that this statement could easily seem frivolous to the reader who is unaware of the occasion on which it arose. One could express the idea, for example, as follows: nature conceals its secrets through the sublime lawfulness of its being, but not through cunning." So we're going to break away a little bit from Einstein temporarily, and I really want to focus now on Veblen. And the Princeton University math department has an incredible project called the Oral History Project. Albert Tucker and William Asprey, excuse me. They are the interviewers during the course of these oral histories, and I just found a plethora of these oral histories. I put in a search for Veblen, and there were probably at least 20 interviews that refer to Veblen, but I have only chosen 2, which I think really best represent Veblen and how Steve and I are trying to discuss him tonight. So Veblen possessed a rare and quiet gift: the ability to earn the enduring respect and admiration of young mathematicians, not through authority, but through generosity, vision, and unwavering support. His influence was not loud, but lasting. It lived on in the minds he shaped, the careers he launched, and the quiet confidence he instilled in those he touched. So one such interview is by Leon W. Cohen. And in the beginning of the interview, he quotes, "Hostility may be too strong a word, a tale of 2 typological traditions, R.L. Moore and Oswald Veblen." So apparently, Veblen had one school of topology, and this R.L. Moore had another school. And Wilder, who happened to be the first PhD student of R.L. Moore, happened to be the advisor for Leon Cohen. And Wilder, he says, "Wilder came to me and said, I think you ought to apply for a National Research Council Fellowship. Go to Princeton and find out what Veblen and his school is doing, and come back and tell us. He goes on to say, you want me to go get a fellowship and go to Princeton? Okay, I'll go to Princeton. And so it happened that I came to Princeton as sort of a spy. So he starts out on this mission, listening to his advisor, Wilder. He's going to come to Princeton. He's going to apply for this fellowship. He gets the fellowship. He comes, and by the way, he was a student from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So he talks about his arrival in Princeton and how overwhelming it was for him, just the social aspect within the university, the town. And lo and behold, he writes, I received enormous help and encouragement. Oswald Veblen had many wonderful characteristics. He was a kind man. To put it bluntly, it was because of Veblen's kindness that I was able to face the situation here. So it's really interesting to think that, you know, here he is on this spy mission sent by Wilder, and lo and behold, he encounters Veblen, and Veblen is welcoming him with open arms and making him feel so welcome in this new environment that he's in. This is a really funny story. So now we move ahead where Cohen is actually at the University of Kentucky, and he's teaching there. And he talks about how Oswald Veblen has now written him a letter. And he writes that there's a list of mathematicians in Germany who are in trouble because of the political situation. Veblen asked if it might be possible to find a place for one or more of these in Lexington. And this is something that Veblen was constantly doing throughout so many different correspondence, which I unfortunately can't include all today. He is constantly finding placements for these displaced mathematicians. Cohen, on the other hand, he says, well, there was no algebraists at Kentucky, so we decided we would like to have Brouwer come. He was on that list. Of course, the difficulty was that the state of Kentucky and the University of Kentucky were broke because it was around the time of the Depression. So let's go back. He comes as a spy, he meets Veblen, and now he feels so dedicated to this person years later that he goes to a colleague, a bacteriologist, and says, how can I get money? And the guy says to him, come with me, we'll walk up and down Main Street and we'll simply hit every merchant on the street and demand money. Now that is what you call dedication, in my opinion. He goes on to say, we raised a sum, not very much, I must say, but I was able to write Veblen and say, we have the money, there is a place here. So I think that just shows a great dedication. Like, why is he taking the time? Veblen, at this point, it's just very evident the level of respect that he has for Veblen, that he goes to these lengths to go up and down Main Street at merchants collecting money so he can write back and say that he has a place for Brouwer. And then lastly, Asprey, who again is part of the project, he asked, can you say any more about Veblen's role in placing refugee mathematicians? And Asprey asked, can you give me Birkhoff's position? And Birkhoff and Veblen worked together, but they also had very different opinions and so forth. Cohen actually says, kind of indicates that Birkhoff thought that him bringing the European mathematicians would take the place of the American mathematicians or Princeton. But he said, Tucker then comes into the conversation and says, Veblen acquired an unfavorable reputation with the administration of Princeton University because he more or less said teaching has a low priority. So Cohen then says, that's an interesting point because one of Veblen's principal contributions in his books and in the people with whom he associated was teaching, and he was an effective teacher. So it's really interesting to see that. The last person I chose from the Oral History Project is Benash Hoffman. So he was at Oxford University, and he was a very frustrated student. He wanted to learn relativity. He had fallen in love with it, but no one was teaching it at Oxford. And then it just so happened in his last year, G.H. Hardy, who was then at Oxford, switched places with Oswald Veblen. He came here and Veblen went to Oxford, and he found out Veblen was interested in this topic. And Veblen came to Oxford and gave lectures, which Hoffman attended. He goes on to say he explained it all. He was able to ask a lot of questions, and that Veblen actually wound up inviting him to come back to Princeton to be his research assistant. And then he gives a point of view, Oxford versus Princeton, the whole teaching method, and he claims that Veblen was an absolute revelation to him. His whole attitude towards mathematics was different. The essential difference was that Oxford professors and lecturers presented a series of lectures that were beautiful, complete, and with no open questions. Veblen, however, was completely different. The Oxford lecturers discouraged any interruptions. They were presenting a beautiful structure, and we shouldn't ask any questions. We should just take it down. Veblen, on the other hand, he says, I don't know how to describe it, was cautionary. He gave the impression that mathematics was an open subject that was still developing, and that you couldn't give an honest, closed series of lectures. He not only allowed interruptions and questions, he enjoyed them. And then last, for the trajectory of the relationship with Hoffman and Veblen, this is interesting. Again, he leaves. He goes on to Rochester to teach in the math department, Hoffman, but he loses his position there. He's very discouraged. He contacts Veblen. Veblen invites him. He actually says, I was really in quite a pickle. I love that little phrasing. He goes, I came back to the Institute, and Veblen was so sweet. He called me into his office, gave me a pep talk, and arranged for a stipend from the Institute. That was renewed for a second year. And it's interesting because him being fired from Rochester actually would lead to him meeting Einstein and working with Einstein. So now we're kind of reintroducing Einstein again. So Hoffman goes on to say that during his second year, he became friends with Leopold Infeld, who had known Einstein back in Berlin and who had worked with him. They joined together and wrote a paper together, Hoffman and Infeld. And Infeld says, why don't we go to Einstein and see if we can work with him? And I think Hoffman was a little hesitant at that, but they went, and Einstein said yes. He would be happy for them both to work with him, and they would go on to essentially collaborate with the Einstein-Infeld-Hoffman equations. And then this is just a little newspaper clipping from the Princeton Herald, March 1st, 1929, showing that Oxford University conferred an honorary degree to Veblen. So now we're going back to Einstein and Einstein's path to Princeton. I'm going to kind of go through this very quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. I'm going to go through a timeline of correspondence. So this is June 1932. June 8th, 1932, you can see the German written letter by Einstein. That is actually a response to probably a few back and forths of Abraham Flexner negotiating, trying to get Einstein to come to the Institute for Advanced Study. But what I want to focus on is Abraham Flexner's letter, and where he points out, in respect to Article 7, Dr. Meyer will receive an independent appointment so that he will be relieved of uneasiness for his own future. As you will see in the next few slides, this Dr. Meyer, who by the way was termed as Einstein's calculator at one time, this was a very important sticking point for Einstein coming to the Institute, and you'll see that as we go along here. So now we go to July 30th, 1932, and Flexner is in Canada, and he's writing Einstein again. Although now he's pointing at Millikan, and Steve had shown you Millikan in the Caltech. He was the head at Caltech. He was kind of serenading Einstein to stay at Caltech. He did not want him to go to the Institute. So Flexner writes, Professor Millikan's suggestion that it would be best for you and science for you to spend a period of 5 or 6 weeks, year after year, in each of several institutions seems quite unsound. So he's trying to talk Einstein out of what Millikan is trying to brainwash him into. He goes, in the first place, the institution must be a stable one. It is also clear that Professor Millikan does not appreciate the value you place on Dr. Meyer's appointment. So he's kind of tagging at that Dr. Meyer appointment. And of course, he does not know of the details that affect you or Frau Einstein's future. And this is the continuation of that letter, and I just kind of added this in because here Veblen is intersecting again. It says, I have heard Veblen and Veblen ate a lot of the delightful evening which they spent with you and your wife. So I'm just kind of showing this interweaving of Veblen still ever present in these correspondences. And now, July 30th, 32. This is basically Einstein's acceptance letter of terms with Flexner. And he writes again, Dr. W. Meyer should have a position which is not attached to mine. He has pled with me that his formal appointment not have any service connotation. He wants to have the feeling that his position is not attached to mine but is independent. So it's just really striking to me that he has such a dedication for getting Meyer this appointment. And then you'll see here, this is Flexner pretty much firming up the deal. He says, you have no fear, respecting Dr. Meyer. He also at the end talks about how he sympathizes with Hale and Millikan. And then he wants to know, will you please tell me the title which you would like to attach to your chair? So it's basically, you know, he will give Einstein whatever he wants at this point. All right, so this came to me as a surprise, and you know, I talk to Steve about this all the time. When you do research, you're looking for something, but then you find something else, and it takes you down a whole nother rabbit hole, right? And then you get completely lost in what you were initially looking for. And as I said, I had, you know, kind of put in a search Veblen, whatever pertains to Veblen. And again, I may not have mentioned, most of my research came from working with Caitlin Rizzo at the Shelby White and Leon Levy archives at the Institute. Also, I had a contact at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Of course, the Oral History Project with the Math Department, and then, of course, the Mudd Manuscript Library at Princeton University Archives. So what I found out was there was a very tense situation going on in 1939. As Steve said, the Institute was housed at Princeton University for many years up until the opening of Fold Hall in May of 1939. And then everyone moved over from Vine Hall. And it was then, and probably a little before then, that Abraham Flexner had put out into the world that he was most likely going to consider retiring, but it was on his terms, and it would most likely occur a year to 2 years later after they finally moved to Fold Hall. However, through these letters I'm going to show to you now, it appears that there was a real tension going on with the faculty, the members, and Veblen and Einstein were a big part of the power players in this getting Flexner out sooner rather than later. They wanted him out by October of that year, so only a few months out. They actually wanted him out before that in the summer. So here you see all of these letters, for the most part, come from Edward Mead Earle's file. He was at the Institute from 1934 to 1954. He was actually recruited by Abraham Flexner in 1934 to help launch the School of Economics and Politics. So why this gentleman is involved in the situation? So it appears that Flexner was a real mentor to him. He deeply respected Flexner, and I think all of the other players in the background that wanted Flexner out knew this, that he had this pull on Flexner, that he could probably persuade him to get him to leave sooner. So what you see in this letter, this is a formal version of a letter that Earle sends to Flexner, and you can see that it is addressed, "My dear Dr. Flexner." And apparently Flexner had gotten wind that there was talk of getting him out and ousted, and he wanted to have lunch with Earle. And the other people talked Earle out of it and said, no, send him a nice letter and then let's work on that. So this is the formal letter. However, attached to the formal letter, he has an informal note. And you can see now he addresses it Dear Abe. The enclosed letter is very formal. That is the letter I just showed you in the prior slide. So that I am adding this purely personal note. Now, I'm not going to go through reading the entire letter to you, but what I will read is that you asked me yesterday that I tell you the truth without fear or favor. As a matter of fact, that is precisely what I have been trying to do in innumerable conversations during the past 3 years. So this has kind of been going on for a while. I have expressed to you in my alarm on a number of points, more specifically your policies vis-a-vis Princeton University, your refusal to admit the existence of anti-Semitism in this community, your openly expressed contempt for fellow members of the faculty, and he goes on and on and on. And he's basically representing these disgruntled AIS members, so to speak. And he's not very happy about it, I must say, because he feels like he's in a very hard position because he greatly admires Flexner, yet he does agree with what's they're proposing. So Herbert Moss, the Bamberger family, for some of you that don't know, the Bamberger family, Louis Bamberger and his sister, they are the ones that provided the funding for the Institute for Advanced Study. They donated $5 million to start the Institute. And Herbert Moss was their attorney, also knew Flexner as well. So now Mead is writing to Moss, getting him involved, and you can see with the arrow that I have there that Einstein, again, is a part of this whole kind of ousting of Flexner. And now we move ahead another week. It seems every week there's a letter in June. So now he's writing Adelot, and Adelot will succeed Flexner eventually after he leaves. And Earl actually points out, I know, for example, that Einstein has decided to resign in October unless there is a new director. So this is pretty, this is pretty significant that Einstein is saying, listen, you don't get a new director. If Flexner isn't out by October, I'm out of here. And then this is kind of the sum of it all. Now he's writing Veblen. And this is basically kind of the culmination before everything goes down. He writes, Adelot called me the other evening just before leaving Mexico City, so I showed you that letter prior, to tell me the latest developments. Hardin has seen Abraham Flexner a second time, and he has written him a secondary emphatic letter telling him that he must resign. So they're gently trying to get him to resign, but he's still holding on. And then they're going on in the bottom here talking about Einstein again and so forth. So after going through all of that tense situation with the Institute, I just wanted to again show you these primary resources are so valuable. And a lot of these archival documents are available to you to access, and they're just stories waiting to be told, right? And I'd like to end on where it all started for me, which Steve talked about, and that was my developing the Institute Woods tour that I do. And Veblen's vision, creating this contemplative space for a place that meant so much to all of these newly arrived members that came from Germany, right? They're leaving their home country. They don't speak the language, and it truly was a community, and the woods was such an important part of this. While I was at the archives with Caitlin, I was very interested to see any original mapping of the Institute Woods. And she said, well, I have this very peculiar map. It's about, and I'm not going to kid you, it's from, almost the size of this screen, to be quite honest. And it's taped together, all haphazardly. And it is hand-drawn. And this is a very small version of what it looked like. But Francis Lepper, who was a member of the Institute in the School of Historical Studies, he was there as a guest member from September 76 to December. So he's only there a very short amount of time. Yet he is so infatuated with these woods, he takes the time to go out and do the survey map. And I mean, the details on it is just incredible. So I just found it so interesting to think that the woods meant so much to this person that was only spending this little amount of time. And again, the legacy of Veblen and his vision for these woods and this space that these members used it for. Next, I know this is a little hard to read, but and this is what I'm going to end with so that we can get going. There was one box in particular, my very last day. It was Veblen's math papers, right? And I am not a mathematician. I'm not into, I have two scientists in my family, but I am not into science. And I was going through this box of all his mathematical equations and theorems, just folder after folder after folder. And then all of a sudden, I came across these 2 poems, which you can barely read, and I will leave a copy of them at the back table if anyone is interested afterwards. But they have to do with the woods, they have to do with nature. And then I came across a very odd object, and this is not the exact object, but I came across this object in a plastic bag. And I said, Caitlin, what in the world is this? And what it was is Veblen had taken 2 bird feathers, kind of conjoined them together, took a twisty, and made antennae, and I call it the Veblen butterfly. And it was stuck in the midst of all these, mathematical folders. And so, of course, I couldn't take the original with me, but I have replicated it, and this is a picture of my cardinal feather one that I made. And I actually bring it on my tour with me, my Institute Nature hike, and people get a real kick out of it. So, again, I want to thank Steve for inviting me here, and all of you for coming tonight. I hope this will spark your interest on Veblen and shed a little more light on Einstein, and absolutely go visit Herrontown Woods and go to the musical event that's coming up. And thank you so much. And Steve, do you want to come up and say a final word?
So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. I also want to say, if you want to come to the musical on Sunday, only come if you've registered, because you won't be guaranteed, you can come, but we are going to be led in by the registration list, and registration is full, and the wait list is full. So we will be having a line where we fill seats at the end, but this event has proven to be extraordinarily popular. We could have probably used a much larger room than this community room to do this event. We're really overwhelmed by the interest. And I also want to thank, and your walk that you do at the Institute for Advanced Studies, that's through the Historical Society?
Yes, so it's typically on a Saturday at 4 o'clock, although we'll be making it earlier since it's going to be getting dark out soon, so it'll most likely start at 3 o'clock. But yes, you can go on the Historical Society website under tours. And yes, it is an extensive hike. It's not an easy hike, I will tell you. It's about a 2.5-hour walk, and there are challenging aspects of it, but everyone really enjoys it. I limit it to 10 people, so it sells out most times very quickly, so definitely keep your eye out for it.
Wonderful. And of course, there's always lots of activities at Herrontown Woods. Okay, so questions for our presenters, okay? Right over here.
Hi, I was a Princeton graduate student, more of a PhD dropout to be honest. My question is more sociological. I'm curious, if you were to do based on the research you do on the archives, how would you say, like, what would a contemporary Oswald Veblen look like in the modern age?
Contemporary, modern.
Yeah, for example, he struck me as someone who is actively engaged in civic engagement, but also very strategic in corporate politics, and also cares about teaching and do a more engaging teaching method. So what might that look like, in the contemporary age?
Well, we have Andy Dobson in the audience. Not to embarrass him, but Andy's an ecologist and brings his groups, teaches a forestry, like a local forestry course, and brings the students out to Herrontown Woods and other preserves. I've been heartened by how the Institute, well, I used to go to lectures at the university about climate change and so forth, and people, biologists would give their lectures about, studying something over in Africa, and it's just kind of heartening to see, meanwhile our local open space is right here, and it does seem like the university's starting to do something a little bit more like the Oswald Veblen did. He would help out on weekends along the canal, pouring out poison ivy. So, and he just was into the local landscape, and I'm sure there's you know, there's birders, there's another ecologist who's really into birding, and so there are some people who are involved, you know, who are at the university, who are also very involved locally. I don't know if there's mathematicians, but I hope to meet them.
Okay, are there other questions? Okay, right over here.
You were talking about the archives you dived into. Were they all at the Institute or where?
I did. Oh. Yeah, so it was pretty equally split on my presentation. Some of them came from the Shelby White Archives at the Institute, the Shelby White Leanne Levy Archives, which, you know, Caitlin is great. She welcomes people to the archives. Unfortunately, I think they're actually under renovation right now, which I had found out right when I was starting this. But if you reach out to her and you're interested in anything specific, she's more than willing to help. And then also I had reached out to the Library of Congress, which I really lucked out because the person I connected with, typically they do not digitally send things to you for nothing. You know, you have to go through a whole process, but they actually sent me quite a bit of information from the Veblen box there, and I'm just actually dying to go down to Washington because there is a plethora of Veblen material at the Library of Congress. Steve and I have talked about, you know, making a road trip maybe down there. I know he's been down there before. And then the Princeton University Archives, I did get quite a bit of stuff from. But the Oral History Project, I was very, very impressed with. And actually at the IAS, they also have an oral history project with many, many oral histories of members throughout the years. That is really, really quite fascinating. In fact, I talk about a few of them on my nature history hike. So they are a great resource for you to look at and find out information about, you know, these people interacting with these famous people that we know of, you know, day in and day out, and a different side and a different perspective, right? Getting different perspectives of these people.
So, but what first whetted your appetite was at the Institute? Or?
So how it came to be was, you know, I'm very interdisciplinary. My father was a master gardener. My grandmother was a historian in her own right. So wherever I have worked, I worked at Grounds for Sculpture for 10 years. And it kind of started there where I was mixing with the tours, I was mixing in the landscape just as much as these sculptures. And I think it was the first time it was really done back then. And then I worked at a place called White Spog Preservation Trust down in the Pine Barrens, which is an old industrial company town with cranberry bogs and blueberries. So I'm always interconnecting environment, nature, and history. So, you know, yeah, I wound up finding Steve because, as you know, I may know I've been with the Historical Society for about 4 years now. I usually lead the Sunday walking tours, but I pitched to Eve, who is in the corner over there, that I had this idea to do a history nature hike. I had seen on Facebook, actually, a picture of the swinging bridge. And I said to my husband, where is this swinging bridge and why have I not been on it? Let's go, I want to find it. So I had never been to the Institute Woods prior to that. So we went one day, we went and we saw the bridge. But lo and behold, I get to the end of Founders Walk where the pond is, and I see this Founders Rock that talks about the Bamberger family, which is what I talk about on my in-town tour. And I'm like, oh my gosh, here's an actual rock talking about it. So that's what prompted me to go to Eve and say, I really want to develop this history nature hike. And it's really been quite successful. I mean, I've had some amazing people take this hike. And it really is a little bit for everyone, different subject matters, again, interdisciplinary. And I feel that when you look beyond your typical realm that you like to stay in, it opens your perspective and you can see what you actually are interested in a different light, right? If you're connecting all these other different perspectives and different fields and different things. So the way I wound up meeting Steve is I wanted to then go to Herrontown Woods. I had never been there before. And Caitlin had said, oh, you want to know about Veblen? You have to talk to Steve Hiltner, right? And I'm like, who is this Steve Hiltner guy, right? So I go to this workshop. It was a workshop to kind of replicate Toshiko Takatsu and her methods of sourcing clay at Herrontown Woods and creating pottery. And I'm walking back to my car after this phenomenal workshop, and I see this guy in the corner, and I say, hey, are you Steve Hiltner? And he goes, yeah, why? and so I proceed to tell him that I created this walk and that I take great enjoyment in promoting Herrontown Woods and trying to bring people to the woods to help his efforts. And he says, you want to go see Veblen's house? And I'm like, sure. And that's kind of how our relationship started.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Steve, I haven't been out there actually in a little bit. I'm usually out there more frequently. How are you guys doing on the house, by the way? Any big updates, or are you just still kind of waiting for the next big step?
Well, I was performing, I have a duo, and I was performing at a place called Salon 33 with a wonderful piano player, and there was a guy in the audience who was taking notes. He had a notebook, a spiral notebook, and at the end of a tune, he said, what was the name of that tune again? Why is this guy taking notes? He turned out to be an architect who's based in Hopewell. And he was I told him about the Veblen house, and there's also Veblen Cottage, just to complicate things. There's two buildings, one dating back to about 1930, one dating back to 1875. So we now have an architect who's very excited about it. That was always a kind of a difficult thing. We had some architects working, but it wasn't quite working out. So that's where we're at now, and we're I think the town wants us to succeed. It's the town doesn't, like a government doesn't always know what to do with a building. Like we see it as an opportunity, and a town can see it as a liability. So thank goodness that we've been able to save it, and it's a sturdy structure, and we have sealed up the basement, we've reinforced it, so it's in really good shape now, ready for
And it's got electricity now, right?
What?
Electricity is in there now?
Oh yeah, we have electricity. We just got a little bit of surveillance cameras, it's out in the middle of the woods, which is part of its charm and also part of its vulnerability, so.
How many people here have been out to Herrontown Woods? Oh, great! Lots of people, that's great. That's good to hear. Okay, I think we'll come to a close here for now. Let's give it up, Cindy and Steve. This is so fascinating.